All right, and we are live again. I hope you can see and hear me, but also the three other amazing panelists that joined me. I think in the last session, we've basically heard a lot about wildfire resilience and the Californian approach. Obviously, Caroline was having, let's say, the regulatory perspective. So I'm very excited that we will dive deeper, especially into WMPs, so wildfire mitigation plans. I just realized that I didn't introduce myself when I introduced Caroline. So as you can see, I'm Patrick. I'm working at Lightyear as the Director of Marketing, but I'm not really important today because all the great panelists and speakers, they are the ones who are having the knowledge that we are sharing during the day. With that being said, I would argue we can quickly jump into this panel already. Again, as the title is saying, we will talk a lot about wildfire mitigation plans. And by we, I mean Melissa, Jay, and Larry. And maybe Melissa, you can start with a quick introduction of yourself, and then Jay and Larry.
Sure. Hi, I'm glad to be here today. My name is Melissa Semcer, and I'm the principal of CWE Strategies, which is Climate, Wildfire, and Energy Strategies. And we are a consulting firm that services both utilities and state regulators, specifically digging into the thorny problems of wildfire mitigation plans. And I'm a good follow-on in that I was Caroline's deputy director, first deputy director at the California Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. So I've taken a lot of the lessons learned there, and then I'm applying them to jurisdictions across the West and with utilities across the West. Glad to be here.
Good morning, everyone. Excited to be here. My name is Jay Leyno.
Oh, we can't hear you, Jay.
Yeah, I think the audio is not working properly.
How about now?
It's a lot of backfeed, yeah.
Yeah. It sounds a bit like there is a microphone somewhere in the back. But we can maybe fix it on stage. Maybe you can click on exactly the audio settings again.
I have to try this.
Jay, I will mute you just for a second so you can figure it out. And then Larry, you can also do your introduction first, basically. And then I think, Jay, take your time, try to figure it out. You can click on more options down below and manage the audio and video settings there and see if another mic is connected, basically. All right.
And while Jay is working through his technical issues, I'm Larry Kahn. I'm a professor at Tulane University Law School, where I co-founded and currently direct the Utility Vegetation Management Institute. I'm also a facilitator of the International Wildfire Risk Mitigation Consortium's Vegetation Management Working Group. And I've been doing a number of consulting jobs as well, working with states, utilities, and service providers and public advocates in order to try to tackle the utility-related wildfire problem.
All right, and we can maybe try it again, Jay.
All right, can you hear me this time?
No, we can hear. It's just got backfeed.
Yeah.
Okay, I even swapped to my headset this time, so still got backfeed.
Yeah.
Let me press forward. Jay Leyno, I'm the director for the Wildfire Mitigation PMO team for PG&E. I've been in this role now for 4 years. Basically, my team oversees the development and the implementation of the Wildfire Mitigation Plan, along with all the other important deliverables associated with the WMP. I've been with PG&E now for 11 years.
Thank you. I think you can let us know in the chat as well. I can still hear you, especially when you start talking. There is a bit of noise in the beginning, and then it's a bit quiet. But I think we can figure that out, and that is completely fine. All right. Thanks for the introductions, and then especially again for people working for utilities either in Europe or in regions that are not basically affected by wildfire mitigation plans, or where they are not necessary already. Larry will do a quick slide-based introduction if I manage to share the slides. I am. So this is good. Again, let us know in the chat if you can see it, but I can see it on stage. And then Larry, mic is yours.
Sure. Yes, okay, thank you. So let's go to the next slide. This is really primarily just to make sure that we're all talking from the same point. So I borrowed this from Greenpeace, which is tracking wildfire problems across the globe. I think that with respect to this, they're probably looking less at North America and really more focused on the rest of the globe. And what you can see from these orange highlights is really the world is on fire. There is a major problem on every continent, and there are large areas that are at extreme risk for wildfire. Next slide, please. The expertise of the folks on this panel, of course, is more focused on North America and the United States in particular. And what you see here from this is the FEMA wildfire risk map. So FEMA is our federal emergency management agency, and they analyzed the on a county by county basis the wildfire risk, and then they rated it. And as you might imagine, red or orange are the highest risk and dark blue is the lowest. If we go to the next slide, I think this part is what's interesting and shocking to most, which is the massive change in wildfire risk that we see spreading from the West Coast to the East Coast. And if you look at there areas that we traditionally think of as very wet, like Florida, Louisiana, coastal parts of Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi, what you're seeing is a lot of red and orange and yellow. And then again through Appalachia in West Virginia and Maryland and up to New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania, you are seeing again a large wildfire risk as analyzed by the federal government, extending up also into Michigan. And if you look at the upper peninsula of Michigan, you are seeing a very, very bright yellow and orange area. In fact, Michigan suffers from thousands of wildfires every year. And so what we are experiencing is a dramatic shift from west to east of the wildfire risk. And capping that off is the combined problem that the East Coast utilities are really not prepared for this. The West Coast utilities have, by and large, been dealing with the wildfire problem for a long time now, and they have resources. I'm not saying they have enough, but they certainly have resources and methodologies and training to be able to deal with wildland fire. And that's not something that East Coast utilities are used to. Next slide, please. But what we see is that throughout the United States, there has always been some sort of wildfire historic range of impact. And some areas it happens much more frequently, other areas much less frequently. But everywhere there is a natural fire risk. And if we were to allow nature to take its course, this is probably what we would see more or less. But obviously, with human populations not dealing well with wildfire and living with wildfire any longer, this is not acceptable. So we need to start combating the wildfire risk. If we want to look at the next slide, what we'll see is really what we can get from the major recent utility related wildfires. And here I'll caveat what this list shows is that these are actually tied to utilities or suspected tied to utilities, and it's marked accordingly. So even in areas where the wildfire risk has not been either admitted or proven, there's at least some allegation that there's a relationship between the utility and the named fire. And if you look at the right-hand column with respect to just the dollar values involved in billions and billions and billions of dollars of losses coming from these fires. And if you look towards the middle with relation to deaths and injuries, this is a very, very substantial problem. And as the fire risk travels from west to east across North America, we are going to see on the eastern states more and more of these levels of problems. And it is no longer good policy to say, it's just a western states problem. This is becoming very real, and it is becoming the kind of thing that the eastern states really need to start paying attention to. And in an effort uh, to try and deal with the wildfire risk problem, states like California initiated a process by which wildfire mitigation plans became necessary. Let's switch to the next slide, please. Now, California was first, and it emerged actually naturally first. California passed regulations that required a minimum setback between trees and power lines in order to reduce the risk of wildfire. And in order to accomplish that, utilities very naturally developed plans by which they would accomplish what the regulations were requiring of them. However, at a certain point, and after some major fires, California then started demanding the production of utilities' wildfire mitigation plans, which went well beyond vegetation management, to start reviewing and approving them. And what we've seen over time is that these wildfire mitigation plans have moved from west to east. We see now that virtually all the western states require wildfire mitigation plans. You see a circle around Missouri. Those of you who are geographically challenged, I circled it for you. Missouri, just in the last couple of weeks, has now started requiring wildfire mitigation plans as well. And so this migration of the requirement to have a wildfire mitigation plan is resulting in new strategies being developed by utility companies and being reviewed by the regulators who oversee them in order to be able to evaluate the efforts that are being made. And so what is a wildfire mitigation plan? What goes into it? What are the elements? How can they be reviewed and analyzed? What's the best approach? That's really what we're here to talk about today. And I really thank LiveEO for sponsoring this part of the program. I think that this is a really valuable thing for regulators as well as the utilities themselves to start considering, and for those utilities and regulators from states that already require them, I think that there's still learning to be done because this is a process and it's part of a spectrum. And as Director Caroline Thomas Jacobs described, it's the turning of that aircraft carrier. We are just beginning to move in the direction that we need to move. And until we get there, there will continue to be problems, but we are evolving toward the right direction. Back to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you for the overview there. Really good for me as well, being a European again, but also in the audience. I think if you're not affected by wildfire mitigation plans, you know what we are talking about now. And what we will do in the next 30-ish minutes is obviously discuss what you've said, Larry, right? What are some of the learnings we had, some of the challenges ahead. But I would like to basically start maybe with not with the main idea necessarily of the plans that we've heard, but Melissa, from your perspective, because you've been on both sides, right? What would you argue is the main purpose or even the main value of these plans? Speaking maybe more for the utilities rather than the regulatory side there.
Sure. One thing I want to add on to what Larry said before we go there is just to point out that we have a lot of cooperatively owned or publicly owned utilities in the United States, and they are often they're situated quite differently than the investor-owned utilities in terms of their resources and experiences and just the number of staff they have and the size of their service territories. And so we talk a lot about the experience in the West and the developed utilities in the West, and that they're the leaders in this. But even within California, there are many small utilities that are trying to solve this problem with a fraction of the resources, and are often somewhat differently situated in terms of how they're treated regulatorily. But as far as the value of a WMP, there's a certain trajectory I've been seeing now over and over again, which is you have a regulation passed or statute passed that says what needs to be in a WMP. It's a list of requirements, and then a utility starts to put together a plan to meet that list of requirements. And often out the gates, it's a shorter plan. It's based off of the utility staff coming together, trying to figure out what they're going to do to address wildfires, but also how they're going to present it to their regulator. And it often is more sort of narrative based and maybe almost geared more towards the public, maybe a little too in the weeds though for the public who just wants to understand what's happening in their backyard, what their utility is going to do to prevent wildfire from impacting their homes and their communities. And it's not really detailed enough to be of great value to the utility, and maybe not detailed enough also to be of great value to the regulator. And that's just a normal starting place that we see. And then from there, where does it become valuable to the utility and also to the regulator? If it's valuable to the utility, it then becomes valuable to the regulator, is when the utility moves beyond sort of strategic direction and gets into the nitty-gritty of what are we going to do and what are we going to hold ourselves to? And often that's driven by regulators saying you need to have targets. It's not just about we're going to trim trees, but what kind of vegetation management are we going to do? Are we going to have it be risk-based as opposed to cycle-based? Are we going to look at our equipment and understand what kinds of open tags that we have and what kind of repairs, what kinds of equipment failures that are causing our ignitions? Are we even tracking our ignitions? Are we tracking our outages? Are we looking at our outage data and trying to understand when we see outages happening during high fire risk days or high fire risk areas? And so when you start to mine that data and start to put together a plan that's based in data, and that is, so that you can track against, that you can start to track against not even just the targets of we cut down this number of trees, but to start to track how many ignitions are we seeing, how many outages are we seeing, how many, we call them public safety power shutoffs, but how often are we proactively shutting off power? Then you start to get a plan that can become, and I'm sure Jay will talk about this more too, can become something that the utility can unite around and that everyone can cite back to and see this is where we're going. And these are the trade-offs that we've agreed upon internally, because everyone they start where they start, right? Everyone starts maybe with a general idea of understanding of risk on their system. They don't have the sophisticated risk models. They don't, they're not necessarily thinking about everything that they need to be thinking about when they think about their risk. They have the data they have the practices that they have, and they have to start somewhere, and they have to kind of coalesce and come together and try to figure out where they're going to go. And it's an evolving process. But, I think the quicker utility can move from this is a document that we are filing to show publicly what we're doing and to frankly show our regulator that we're doing and to get cost recovery for what we are doing and coalesce around it as an internal document that's a North Star, I think the more effective it becomes.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen Jay nodding quite a lot. So Jay, maybe you can guide us. I think there's a lot of noise now, at least for me. Maybe Jay, you can guide us through how PG&E is basically approaching the WMP right now. We will dig a bit more into the history maybe and the lessons learned later on, but if you can give us the picture there, that would be awesome.
I'd be happy to. So here at Pacific Gas and Electric, we have a dedicated wildfire emergency and operations function. And within the wildfire function, we do have a dedicated wildfire mitigation team. So for example, my team is a team of 21 team members that are dedicated directly and solely focused on all W&P deliverables. So when we think about it from a W&P development standpoint, we do have many milestones that we achieve from day one to our filing day. And just kind of highlighting some of our major milestones during that time frame, the first and foremost, we want to ensure that our W&P aligns with all of our major filings, such as our general rate case, our RAMP, which are our risk assessment and mitigation phase, our CAVA filing, which is our climate adaptation vulnerability assessment, and ultimately also our EUP, which is our undergrounding, electric undergrounding plan. We also, before we get into our development, we want to obtain our senior leadership guidance on strategy all the way up to our CEO, Patty Poppy. We benchmark, we do a lot of benchmarking with a lot of the California utilities, just seeing what they're including in their W&P, what mitigations are they including, not including, what have worked, what have not. And then ultimately we work with our SMEs on drafting the W&P before it goes through multiple rounds of reviews with our law regulatory team, our functional areas and senior leadership before we file. Once we file, we kind of turn switch our gears over to the implementation of our W&P, which we utilize Lean to track our implementation. And two key plays that we use from the Lean playbook are our visual management, to where we can see within 1, 3, and 10-second views how we're performing. Are we on track? Are we at risk? Are we off track at a very high level? And we utilize our operating reviews to be able to share this progress. So we stood up a wildfire risk command center back in 2021. We meet on a weekly basis to go over our key metrics of how we're performing from a W&P standpoint, how we're performing from an ignition standpoint, because we do also have a dedicated ignitions investigations team that goes out and analyzes and investigates every ignition that we have in our service territory to be able to tell us, do we have mitigations in place for this type of ignition? Did it get through our control that we put in place? Where do we need to enhance mitigations? Where do we need to install or to think and strategize on a new mitigation to prevent this ignition from happening? So that's what we're doing here at PG&E on both the development and the implementation of our wildfire mitigation plan. Patrick.
Nice. And the audio is working perfectly now as well. So
awesome.
right in time, so everyone could follow your answer. Really great example. Larry, maybe, I mean, you said it in the beginning as well, but looking at W&Ps in general and basically their expansion, so to say, how do you see the topic evolving basically to the east, as you said, in the upcoming years?
Sure. Well, I think that if we look at what's happened in the Western states, and especially in California, as to the development of wildfire mitigation plans generally, I think that that's likely what we're going to see as this movement towards having effective wildfire mitigation plans develops eastward. So what we saw initially in California was that wildfire mitigation centered around vegetation management as a first effort. And that makes good sense because the vegetation is generally what provides the fuel in a wildland fire and allows it to grow and expand and impact both populated and unpopulated areas and cause widespread damage. And so the initial plans came essentially from that. I think if you were to go back in time and ask vegetation managers at utility companies, why do you do this? I think the answer would have come back, well, it's to prevent wildfires. Sure, there's an impact on reliability and preventing outages as well. But I think the major focus for a long time out west was the wildfire prevention aspect of veg management. And then it became clear that there were other things impacting this as well, including, for example, asset management. And regrettably, I don't think that there's a single utility in the country, probably very few around the world, if any, that can say they know every single piece of equipment that is deployed in the field, and what its service history is, what its life expectancy is, when it needs to be replaced, all of that sort of thing. They just don't know. And to a certain extent, before people start yelling, "Oh, that's completely irresponsible. How could they do this?" I think it's important to keep in mind that most utilities that we see today are actually uh, the 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 the, the result of smaller companies that join together and form the system that we have now. And so the record keeping that existed 100 years ago was scant at the time, and so to recreate that effort was challenging at least, and the ability to really start doing good organized record keeping really hasn't occurred. Not that it couldn't have been done on paper and spreadsheets, but really to make good use of it, that technology really hasn't existed except in the last decade or so. And so to question, well, why don't they have this, really is an unfair question to utilities existing now. It's because they have 100 years of data to catch up on, and and that's a tall effort, especially when you consider that in the United States we have something on the order of 8 million miles of utility lines crisscrossing this country, and it's just a very, very significant task. Fortunately, advanced technology tools, I think, are going to help us get through that. And as we look at the evolution of a wildfire mitigation plan, it started with VEG. I think it moved to assets, and then it developed into other topics as well, like like protocols and risk, and understanding what all of this is, how it all works together, and that's why you have these separate disciplines all contributing together. What is going to happen in eastern states as the wildfire mitigation plan requirement comes into effect from west to east? I think they're going to have to start thinking about how to get this all done all at once. That's going to be a very, very difficult thing. It's going to be an expensive learning curve. And it's really why eastern utilities are going to have to start doing this process now before it's required, because it will be required sooner or later. And if they can start formulating their plans now, they will be substantially better off. And so will their customers, who might benefit from the development of wildfire mitigation strategies now before they become required.
Yeah, thank you for answering the question. I think there was a lot in there already. And again, talking a bit about learnings maybe, but also Melissa, things like if you would work for a utility in the East now, considering the learnings, well, Larry mentioned, but also you've seen, basically, how would you basically approach the creation of a plan? I mean, in the beginning, you mentioned that, well, probably one of the mistakes that a utility could do is to just have a plan on paper, and there is not much value in it. Would you start with everything all at once? Would you start with, okay, my state is introducing a regulatory model that I need to comply to, so I'm just doing the bare minimum? I know, extensive question, but what would be your take there?
Where would you start? Right. I think that's where you're saying is, where would you start? So here's the first place I would start. One is getting utilities and regulators in dialogue before there's statute, before there's regulation. Because what happens, what I've seen happen over and over again, is that when it comes quickly. It usually comes on the heels of another major fire. That's been the impetus we've seen as it continues to spread east. It's always after a major event, and then it's a quick action, and it can really stifle dialogue. Once you have regulation in place, you have a case open. You now can no longer, in a lot of formats, you cannot speak freely with your regulator anymore. So immediately moving beyond the framework of us and the regulator, right? And we're against each other, which is a model that's in place. Again, this is for investor-owned utilities, not the same for publicly owned utilities. But it's in place and it has a place when it comes to monopolies and regulation of economic regulation. It has very minimal place in my point of view when you're looking at a problem like this. This is a massive problem, and we need to immediately switch to us versus the problem and how are we going to solve it. So getting in that dialogue before anything passes, I think is one of the best things that a utility can do. The next thing is stepping back, and the first step is, where is our risk? That's the biggest question a utility has to ask. And you can get into these very sophisticated, very complex, very expensive models that some of the larger IOUs are using in California and out throughout the West, that are needed because they were covering large, expansive service territories. But I was meeting with a smaller utility recently, a publicly owned utility, has a very small service territory, and they know their system. And they can sit down around a table and they can just talk about it and say, where is our risk? And then they can meet with their local fire departments and validate that. If a fire starts, where are we most concerned that it's going to spread? Is it coming down that canyon? Is it, into that town? What are our risk factors? So starting just very basic. The other thing is again, looking at the outages, and that's a good place to start, right? So most utilities do have some history of tracking outages. Is the way it's tracked exactly as you need it to understand a risk of wildfire? No. I mean, I've seen them not even be tracked at the latitude, longitude, but just kind of a general area. But it's start with what you have. Start to really understand the holes in your data and start to say, okay, we've seen outages. These outages are happening in summer. We know that that's a drier time of year for us, depending on where you are. What are we seeing? Are we seeing them that they're from vegetation, or are we seeing them that they're from equipment failures? Starting to try to just understand, again, Larry raised this, and I can't emphasize this enough. What's on your system? And I think in today's day and age, whether your wildfire is your risk, hurricanes are your risk, whatever your risk is, knowing what's on your system, knowing where it's located. Do you have a GIS database? I mean, I know this sounds really fundamental, but this is where a lot of utilities are. Are your assets named by an ID number or by latitude, longitude? What do you have? If you can get to flying drones over your system, that can be an inexpensive but really valuable tool to fly and actually look at the health of your system. Look at the proximity of the trees to your lines. That's a basic place that you can start. And I mean, those are the areas, that I would recommend starting with. And then again, once you actually start to get into a plan, I mean, what's the low hanging fruit? How can I get risk off my system as rapidly as possible? It can be installing weather stations so that you can actually understand on a granular level what kinds of feature, or what kind of weather your system is going to be exposed to on a more granular basis. Changing out fuses that blow and emit sparks, and then you can replace those with non-expulsion fuses. Like, there's actually a lot of investments utilities can make that are not hugely expensive, and that you can get started on pretty quickly, that we know have a really good sort of cost benefit or risk spend efficiency ratio, and are essentially the low hanging fruit. So that's where I would say utilities should start. But number one, immediately move to, it is us versus the problem. And how are we all going to get together, including with our firefighters, to solve this problem?
Right. If I could follow up on what Melissa just said, I wholeheartedly agree. I think, though, that it's important for utilities that are not yet there to start thinking about what should their first steps be.
Mhm.
And if you're going to look at the massive amounts of money that are being spent out west, and you're asking yourself, gee, can I afford that? I think the thing to do is to start looking for partners who are already doing something that they have a specialty that you don't have yet. So think, for example, firefighting. Start talking to your state fire marshal if you have one. If you don't have one, start talking to the local fire departments and fire chiefs that are spread throughout your service territory, and ask them, where are the fire risks? Help us help you, and form cooperative arrangements so that you can build a team that can work together in the event of a wildfire happening, and start doing that now. The time to start preparing for a wildfire is not after it's happened, it's before it's happened, and that's now. And if you can do that now, you can avoid expensive redundancies. I think a lot of utilities out west have internal departments that duplicate things that exist in the communities. They've had to do that because they were doing it as a reaction. And now that they have them, what they have is actually better than what existed outside. But it would have been probably more financially and timing wise efficient to have simply helped their colleagues better better their own capabilities so that they could work more cooperatively together. Now you've got better systems, but there was back and forth and holes and gaps and things that needed to be filled. And this is not the time to do that. We've got to recognize that there's an emergency and it's coming, and it's time to react now, not after the fires occurred. Asking a lot of the Western utilities, what would you recommend to a utility? No preparations whatsoever. What I hear most is they say, hire a meteorologist and do that now. Because meteorology is just not as well understood in the East, and it's one of the major factors in having a fire. And understanding the relationship between wind and humidity and vegetation and the dryness and soil conditions, all of those sorts of things that build into meteorological predictions is an essential part of running your utility effectively. And unfortunately, there aren't really those meteorological resources generally available. They tend to be a creature of the federal government, which is hit or miss based on how many weather systems they've actually deployed and the quality of them. And I think right now, California utilities are far better equipped to tell you what the weather is going to be than the federal government is.
Yeah, thanks for both answers. And Jay, yeah, I wanted to ask you as well if you have an addition there. So please, you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
I want to touch on a couple of lessons learned that we've learned throughout the years with filing a WMP. One is we file a WMP every 3 years with the opportunity to update within the next 2 years within that 3-year period. So we can't be solely focused on just executing what is in the WMP, because what we're learning is that the risk is evolving and we need to be able to evolve with the risk. So we need to be able to analyze every ignition that we have to determine if there are new mitigations that need to be stood out outside of what we already have within the WMP. So when we see these spikes tend to occur, such as last year and this year, we stand up what we call a task force to do exactly that. What additional mitigations can we put in place beyond our WMP to address the risk, the evolving risks that we're seeing? That's one lesson learned. Another is, unfortunately, we don't want to see other utilities have wildfires or any wildfires throughout the industry. But when they do happen, it's essential that we learn from the events that do happen. So, for example, from the Southern California fires that happened earlier on this year, we took additional steps with our idle facilities, because that is potentially a cause for the Southern California fires. Hasn't been determined yet, but we still want to take that additional step to make sure idle facilities aren't associated with any ignitions. We also launched our transmission structure risk reduction initiative, which we identified almost 4,000 high-risk transmission structures, where we cleared an additional 50-foot radius or zone of vegetation around those structures. So those are two main key points. You just can't be solely focused on what's in the WMP. And then it's essential to learn from other events that happen to ensure that they don't happen in your service territory.
I think that's really an important thing, Jay. Thank you for that. The one thing that should really be mentioned and highlighted is that there are resources out there that utilities and regulators can reach out to and get advice from. One is the International Wildfire Risk Mitigation Consortium. It's a member-based organization, primarily of utilities from around the world that are looking to end the utility-ignited wildfire problem. So that is a resource that can easily be joined. Another is PG&E itself. After the fires and the tragedies that have occurred within its territory, PG&E has adopted a policy that they are there to see the end of utility-related wildfires, and they open themselves up, I think, once a year to provide information to any utility willing to come and learn from their experience and be able to benefit from that. And when it comes to vegetation management, certainly come to Tulane. And we're here to provide the information and to assist, because that is critical to keeping uh, customers and territories safe from the wildfire risk.
Can I add on to that? So you made a great point there, Larry. So PG&E, we do host a free 2-day conference annually around wildfire mitigation. Beyond that, we do also have a monthly joint or a monthly utility meeting in California that includes, I stood this up a few years ago, it includes PG&E, SE, SDG&E, Bear Valley, Liberty, Pacific Core, Hawaiian Electric also attends, Excel also attends. So we have a forum where we do get together to collaborate on specifically around wildfire mitigation plans on a monthly basis. We'd love to help anybody that would need the help. We're here to help. Do not start this endeavor alone. You have resources here, including me and the rest of the California utilities, to help you out.
Awesome. And just looking at the time here, and Larry, Jay, you were saying a very valuable thing. So Melissa, we have 1 or 2 minutes left. Maybe you have any closing remarks here for the audience before we hop into the next panel. But I think it was a great discussion. We had a comment about it as well. And you didn't even need me as a moderator here. So that's even better. But Melissa, feel free to try to give one final piece of advice or wrap it up a bit from your perspective.
I think, I mean, just get started. Don't be worried about not having the same number of resources. I know, Jay said 21 people just on the Wildfire Mitigation Project Management Office. The utility I was working with had 130 staff for their entire utility, right? It's okay. Just get started. And yes, reach out. Almost everyone in this industry, in this field, wants to reduce this and wants to help. So it seems to be a very open door policy from what I've seen.
Awesome. And I think that's exactly what we want to do today as well, right? Learn from each other. And I think all of you are quite active on LinkedIn as well. So if you're in the audience now, feel more than welcome to text everyone on LinkedIn and add them. And I think there are several physical and virtual events where you will be on stage as well. And I feel like this was such a good session. And we maybe want to do a standalone in the upcoming weeks or months, depending on the schedules here. All right, as we are a minute over time and the next panel is waiting already, thank you again, all three of you, for joining, and especially for providing very practical, valuable insights. As Melissa said, I think the time to start is always now. And you've basically heard all the great learnings here. You can also watch the recording afterwards. I forgot to mention that before. So if you want to rehear what everyone was saying, do it. All right, that being said, as we did it before, we will say goodbye here now. Everyone will see a quick waiting screen for a minute, and then you see the next panel. But again, Melissa, Jay, Larry, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.